Three men entered the Coldwater Ridge corridor on a Saturday morning in November of 2017. By Monday, two of them were dead. The third crawled out of the forest 2 days later with injuries that required 6 surgeries to repair. Authorities ruled it a hunting accident. I was still working the southeastern sector of the Mark Twain National Forest. When that case came through, I read the report, I read the survivor's statement, and I am telling you, as someone who spent 22 years in that forest, who knows that terrain the way most people know their own backyard, that ruling does not account for what that man described. It does not account for the bone pile that search teams found under a white oak near Coldwater Ridge. Human bones, multiple individuals, some weathered to fragments, some recent enough to still carry tissue. And it doesn't account for the fact that the two men who died have never been found. The case was filed. The section was closed. The forest continued as it always had. But the facts of that November do not reconcile with the official determination. They never did. And I stayed quiet about it for a long time, the way you learn to stay quiet when you work for a government agency, and the decision has already been made above your pay grade. I am not staying quiet anymore. My name is not important. What I did for 22 years in the Mark Twain National Forest is important. What I saw in that time, what I documented, what I was told to set aside and not pursue, that is what this is about. I want to start at the beginning, not with November 2017, earlier than that, much earlier. The Mark Twain National Forest covers approximately 1.5 million acres across southern Missouri. It is one of the largest stretches of publicly managed forest land in the central United States. I know it the way a person knows something they have given the better part of their life to. The current river drainage, the oak and hickory ridges above Winona, the shortleaf pine stands on the upper elevations. I have walked more miles of that ground than I could count. I have camped in it in November when the temperature dropped to single digits. I have worked searches in it in July when the heat in the hollows is something you feel in your lungs. It is not a forgiving landscape, but it is a knowable one. In most places, the forest draws hundreds of thousands of visitors every year, developed campgrounds along the current river corridor, maintained trails for hikers and mountain bikers, designated hunting zones for deer and turkey. The Missouri Department of Conservation keeps active oversight of wildlife populations throughout the region. It is a well-managed, extensively documented piece of public land. When I started as a ranger in the early 1990s, my district supervisor gave me a standard orientation, trail systems, emergency protocols, flood zones, wildlife patterns by season, the routine information that any new ranger receives. And then, at the end of that first week, he took me aside and told me one thing that was not in any printed briefing. He said, "Stay out of the Coldwater Ridge corridor unless you have a direct operational reason to be there. Don't patrol it on your own. Don't encourage visitors to explore it. And if you start getting complaints from that area, sounds, disorientation, anything unusual, you log it, you file it, and you move on." I asked him why. He looked at me for a moment and then he said, "Because some places in this forest have a history that doesn't fit in a report, and that corridor is one of them." I was 26 years old. I thought he was being dramatic. I thought he was passing along the kind of superstition that accumulates in isolated communities where the landscape is old and the stories run deep. The Ozarks have always had their share of that. Every long-settled region does. I was wrong to dismiss it. I found out why he said it in the summer of 1998. I had been a ranger in the southeastern sector for 6 years by then. I knew the terrain well. I was comfortable in that forest in a way that takes years to build. On an August afternoon, I was running a patrol along the eastern boundary of the corridor. Routine work, nothing unusual on the schedule. I had been walking for about 2 hours when I crossed a dry creek bed and stopped. There were tracks in the dried mud along the bank. I have spent 22 years reading animal sign in that forest. Deer, bear, coyote, turkey, hog. I know what their tracks look like in every substrate and every season. What I was looking at did not belong to any of those animals. The impressions were bipedal. Each print measured close to 15 inches from heel to toe. The toe impressions were broad and clearly defined. 5 of them splayed in a way that suggested significant weight pressing through the forefoot. The stride between prints was nearly 6 feet. I stood in that creek bed for a long time. I measured the prints with the folding rule I carried on patrol. I photographed them with the disposable camera I kept in my pack for documenting trail damage and wildlife sign. And then I followed the track line north along the bank for approximately 80 yards before the ground hardened and the prints became unreadable. I knew what I was looking at. I had heard the name since I was a child growing up in Missouri, the same name that people across the Ozarks had been using for generations to describe reports like this one, Bigfoot, a name that most people in professional wildlife management treat as folklore, as regional legend, as the kind of thing that gets filed under public relations problem rather than wildlife observation. I had treated it the same way myself up to that afternoon. What I saw in that creek bed in August of 1998 was not folklore. It was physical evidence in dried mud that I measured, photographed, and recorded in my patrol log. The prints were real. Whatever made them was real, and it was large enough and heavy enough that its passage through soft substrate left impressions nearly an inch deep at the heel. I filed the report. I included the photographs. My supervisor at the time reviewed the entry, asked me 2 questions about the location and substrate conditions, and then told me the photographs would be forwarded for review. I never heard anything further about them. The file was categorized, as these things always were, as unresolved wildlife observation. But I knew what I had seen, and after that afternoon I understood exactly what my first supervisor had meant when he told me that Coldwater Ridge had a history that didn't fit in a report. What locals in this region have called Bigfoot for generations is not a single sighting, not a single set of tracks, not a single account from a single person. It is a pattern that runs through the documented record of the Coldwater Ridge corridor, for as far back as that record extends. A pattern of physical evidence, a pattern of behavioral responses in other animals, a pattern of encounters described by experienced outdoorsmen who have no reason to fabricate what they report, and every professional reason not to. The Coldwater Ridge corridor is approximately 12 miles long and 5 miles wide. It sits in a section of particularly rugged ground west of where Highway 60 crosses the Current River. The terrain is steep. The hollows are deep. The forest in that section is old growth in character. Trees of a diameter and density that tell you this ground has not been logged or significantly disturbed in a very long time. There are no developed facilities inside it, no marked trails. The parking area at the nearest access point when I drove past it during my patrols always looked the same. Overgrown, unused, grass growing up through the gravel. Capable people chose not to go there. Over time I came to understand that this was not an accident. The 3 men who entered that corridor in November 2017 were not outsiders. They were not inexperienced. They had grown up in the Ozarks. Between them they had more than 80 years of hunting experience in this specific landscape. They had heard the same things everyone in the region had heard about Coldwater Ridge, and they went in anyway. Within 48 hours, that decision had cost 2 of them their lives. What I'm going to tell you now is the account, theirs and mine, and the broader record that both of us fit into. The disappearances along the Coldwater Ridge corridor did not start with those 3 men in 2017. I want to be clear about that, because it matters. It matters a great deal. Between 1979 and 2016, before that November, before the search, before the bone pile, 14 hunters and outdoor recreationists were reported missing within a 12-mile radius of that same ridgeline. 9 bodies were eventually recovered. 5 were not. I was working the southeastern sector for the last 12 years of that period. I was there for some of those searches. I remember them. The Missouri Department of Conservation attributed the documented deaths to hunting accidents, exposure, and the difficulty of the terrain. Each case was handled individually. No one officially looked at them as a pattern, but I looked at them as a pattern, because that is what they were. Of the 9 individuals who were recovered, 7 were found in locations that contradicted their last known positions by distances and terrain features that the search teams could not adequately explain. In 3 cases, The remains were found in areas that had already been physically walked during the initial search, areas I personally covered on foot that came back empty. Those same areas, months or sometimes years later, produced remains. I don't have a standard explanation for that. I have looked for one for a long time. I don't have one. The 5 people who were never found represent something I think about more than I probably should. Personal equipment doesn't just disappear in forested terrain. Packs decay, but they leave hardware behind. Weapons rust, but metal doesn't vanish. Clothing deteriorates, but buttons and zippers and boot soles persist in the soil for decades. In the Coldwater Ridge corridor, across multiple unrelated disappearances spanning decades, personal items consistently were not found, not degraded, not scattered, not present. The earliest case I know well from the written record involves a man in his mid-40s who entered the corridor alone on November 9, 1979, a deer hunter, a local, someone who had hunted the surrounding drainages for more than 20 years. His truck was found at the Forest Service access road 3 days after he was expected back. A 10-day search produced nothing. No equipment, no blood, no indication of where he went after he parked. He was declared deceased a year and a half later. His remains were never located. In the fall of 1986, 3 hunters went in together. 2 came out. The third did not. The 2 who returned said they had separated from him around midday on a ridge about 4 miles in. They heard a single shot, the kind you fire when you've taken an animal, and then silence. They waited 2 hours, then they hiked out. A search the following morning found nothing over 5 days. The missing man's rifle was never recovered. His body was found 14 months later by a survey crew working a drainage 2 miles from where his companions last heard that shot. The official cause of death was listed as undetermined. The medical examiner couldn't establish cause from the condition of the remains. What that notation doesn't address is this: the drainage where the survey crew found him had already been walked during the original search. The crew lead noted that the hollow showed no sign of disturbance, no indication a body had been present for over a year, and there was no reasonable route by which the man could have reached that location from his last known position given the terrain between the 2 points. I walked that terrain myself years later, trying to understand it. I couldn't. In October 1994, a turkey hunter in his early 30s signed the self-registration form at the Northern Trailhead at 5:47 in the morning. He was the only entry that day. He didn't come back to his vehicle. He searched that afternoon, found his turkey call hanging from a branch about 800 yards in. Beyond that point, nothing. The search dogs worked from the call and tracked northeast for a few hundred yards before stopping. I was part of that search. I saw the dogs stop. I watched the handlers try to redirect them into the sector north of where the scent ended. Those dogs would not go. Not one handler, not one dog. We ran 2 separate teams on 2 separate days with different animals. Same result. Both times the dogs showed what I can only describe as active avoidance, not the confusion you see when scent is lost, but something more like refusal, like an animal that has identified a threat and will not approach it regardless of what its handler tells it to do. That man was never found. I've thought about those dogs more than almost anything else from my 22 years. Because that behavioral pattern is not isolated to 1994. In 7 of the 14 documented disappearances from that corridor between 1979 and 2016, search dogs exhibited anomalous responses: avoidance, reluctance. In 4 of those 7 cases, the dogs refused to enter specific areas entirely. The sectors they wouldn't enter didn't correspond to any known hazard: no water, no terrain feature, no documented wildlife concentration that would explain it. Search and rescue dogs are conditioned to work through almost anything. They work in darkness, in foul weather, in terrain that their handlers struggle to navigate. The consistent pattern of behavioral anomaly in this specific geographic area, across different teams, different dogs, different years, has never been formally explained. What researchers who study Bigfoot encounters have documented across hundreds of cases is precisely this: trained dogs refusing to enter areas of known activity. The refusal is not random, it is specific to location. And in this corridor it has been specific to the same locations year after year. I filed reports on it. I noted it every time. Those reports were received, acknowledged, and filed. Nothing followed. There was a notation I made in the mid-2000s that I want to tell you about, because it connects to something I personally experienced. The notation described a recurring pattern of visitor complaints from the terrain adjacent to the corridor, not inside the closed sections, which by that point had been informally understood as off-limits, but from the accessible ground nearby. The complaints organized themselves around three things: unusual sounds, disorientation without navigational cause, and the sudden disappearance of wildlife from areas where it had been present moments before. The sounds described in those complaints were not from known regional wildlife. I know what coyotes sound like. I know what barred owls sound like in the dark in the Ozark Hollows, and they sound like something that should not be there if you've never heard one before, but they are cataloged and understood. The sounds described to me by experienced hunters and outdoorsmen, people who had been in that forest for decades, were something different. Vocalizations that moved between registers inconsistent with any single known animal. Sounds coming from directions where nothing could be positioned given the terrain. And the silence, always the silence. I heard it myself once in 2008, while running a routine patrol along the eastern boundary of the corridor. I was alone. It was late afternoon, and the forest had been producing the normal ambient sound of a functioning Ozark woodland in October. Squirrels, woodpeckers working the snags, a group of crows moving through the canopy somewhere to my north. And then, in the space of perhaps 3 seconds, all of it stopped. Complete silence. The kind of silence that is not natural in a living forest, because a living forest is never truly silent. I stood still for perhaps 10 minutes. Nothing moved. Nothing called. The silence held completely. And then gradually, over the course of maybe another 5 minutes, the sounds returned. The squirrels, the birds, the ordinary noise of ordinary woodland. I wrote it in my patrol log. My supervisor acknowledged the entry and said nothing further. Forest ecologists will tell you that mass acoustic silencing, the kind that shuts down an entire wildlife community simultaneously, is a documented stress response. It occurs when a predator of sufficient magnitude triggers a simultaneous fear response across multiple species. The threshold is high. The stimulus must be immediate, credible, and large enough to register as a threat to everything from songbirds to squirrels at the same moment. In the normal course of Ozark wildlife ecology, this does not happen without a very specific cause. Bigfoot researchers have documented this phenomenon, what some call a dead zone, in connection with areas of sustained activity across multiple states. The pattern in this corridor matches those documented accounts in both character and duration. In 2003, a hunter working the eastern boundary of the corridor brought photographs to the ranger station at Winona. He had found tracks in creek mud and photographed them before they could degrade. I examined those photographs. The impressions measured 16 inches in length, 5 toe impressions clearly defined. The depth of the prints suggested a weight load that a colleague of mine with wildlife biology training estimated at over 400 pounds. The stride between prints ran between 5.5 and 6 feet. There is no documented quadrupedal species native to Missouri that produces a track of those dimensions with that stride length. What those dimensions do match, precisely, is the physical profile that has been consistently described in Bigfoot, track evidence documented by field researchers across the Ozarks, the Appalachians, and the Pacific Northwest for decades. 16-inch prints, 5 toes, a stride that requires a leg length and a body mass far beyond any known North American primate. My colleague also noted something visible in the photograph series. The track pattern alternated over approximately 30 yards of trackable substrate between what appeared to be quadrupedal movement and what appeared to be bipedal movement. The depth and spacing of the prints changed in a way consistent with a transition between gaits. I have spent time looking at that file. I have not found a satisfactory explanation for what those photographs show. Neither has anyone else who has examined them. The file was categorized as unresolved wildlife observation. It is still open. In April 2009, 3 hikers in a drainage west of the corridor boundary filed statements with the same ranger station describing a sulfurous odor with no geological explanation that persisted for about 20 minutes before vanishing without any change in wind direction. During that same period, 2 of the 3 observed movement at the tree line, something large and dark, moving through heavy timber at a speed and with a quality of movement that one of them described as inconsistent with any deer or bear he had seen in 30 years of field experience. It did not emerge from the trees. It moved parallel to the drainage at roughly 80 yards before disappearing from their line of sight. The sulfurous odor is one of the most consistently reported sensory details in documented Bigfoot encounters. It has been described in accounts from Missouri, Arkansas, Oklahoma, and across the broader Ozark region. The combination of that specific smell, the large dark shape moving with speed through heavy timber, and the total acoustic silence that accompanied both. That combination appears in the documented record of Bigfoot activity more consistently than almost any other cluster of observations. The third member of the group saw nothing but confirmed the smell, the silence, and the feeling of sustained attention from a fixed point outside their view. All 3 left immediately. None were injured. I received those statements. They are in the file. Now I want to tell you about November 2017, because that is where everything in the record before it converges. The 3 men who entered the corridor that Saturday were not strangers to that landscape. The oldest was 53, a former Marine, 2 tours overseas, 30 years of hunting in the Mark Twain. The second was 41, third-generation local. His family had hunted that forest for decades. The third was 38, a mechanic by trade, more than 20 years in the field. These were not people who made careless decisions in the woods. Between the 3 of them, they represented a level of competence that most recreational hunters never approach. They drove in on the second Saturday of November. Weather was favorable. Low 20s overnight, upper 40s during the day, clear skies, light wind from the northwest. They parked at a trailhead that showed no signs of recent use. No fresh tire tracks, no boot prints, grass growing through the gravel, same as it always looked. They hiked approximately 6 miles in and established a camp on a flat bench with good sight lines in 3 directions. The first thing they noted, the first documented anomaly, was the silence. During their first evening in the corridor, the forest went quiet earlier than any of them had experienced. Well before sunset, during the period when wildlife in the Ozarks is typically most active, deer that had been visible on 3 separate ridges disappeared all at once, not gradually the way animals move toward evening feeding areas, but instantly, as if the ground had simply emptied. No owls that night, no coyotes, which in November should have been actively vocal, nothing. I have read the surviving man's account of that first evening many times. When he describes the quality of the silence, the way it felt different from the normal quiet of a sleeping forest, I recognize it. I heard it myself in 2008 and again in that creek bed in 1998 just before I found the tracks. He calls it a quality of attention. He says it felt as though the forest was aware of them in a way that functioning natural environments are not. I know exactly what he means. It is the same quality I have felt in that corridor more than once. It is what I now understand to be the presence of something large and intelligent in terrain it considers its own. During the early hours of the following morning, one of the group heard movement in the hollow below their camp. Large, deliberate, the rhythm of something that understood how to move through difficult terrain. By the time a second man joined him at the edge of camp, the sound had stopped. Nothing visible. The second day produced no wildlife, none. Terrain that had shown abundant sign during their approach, fresh rubs, active tracks, recent droppings, was empty. They split up at dawn to take positions on the eastern ridge. Around 10 in the morning, a single shot came from the direction of the oldest member's position. One shot, deliberate. The kind of shot a hunter fires at game, no follow-up, no radio contact. When the 41-year-old went to investigate after more than an hour of silence, he found the man's pack and rifle at his position. Rifle leaned against a tree the way a patient hunter leaves it, and the man was gone. The tracks leading away from the position were clear for approximately 50 yards. Then they stopped. open ground, no obstruction, no change in substrate. The tracks simply ended. No displaced leaf litter beyond the final prints, no indication of what had happened. They searched for more than an hour, no blood, no drag marks, no evidence of struggle, nothing. Approximately 3 hours later, conducting a grid search north of that position, they found the bone pile. I heard about that deposit the same day the search teams came out. I was already retired by November 2017, but I still knew people in the agency. When they described the location, the base of a large white oak, a depression in the forest floor, multiple individuals represented across a range of depositional ages, I knew what they were describing before they finished telling me, because I had heard rumors of that deposit for years, not documented, not filed, just known, the way certain things are known in a place where people have worked the same ground long enough. Bigfoot researchers who have studied long-term territorial behavior have documented the existence of what they call bone caches, locations where remains accumulate over extended periods, apparently associated with areas of sustained activity. The Coldwater Ridge deposit, multiple individuals, a range of depositional ages spanning what forensic assessments suggest was decades, all concentrated in a single natural depression, fits that description precisely. The surviving man counted at least 4 skulls. He estimated the total remains suggested between 6 and 10 individuals. The forensic assessment that followed could not determine cause of death for the older material. The more recent material was associated with at least 2 individuals. Neither has been formally identified in any publicly available record. It was at the bone pile that the surviving man first clearly saw what had been present in that corridor since they arrived, standing approximately 50 yards away, positioned between them and the route back to their camp. A shape, tall, substantially taller than any person he had encountered. The proportions wrong, limbs too long for the torso, shoulders too narrow for the height, standing with complete stillness. Not the stillness of an animal that has frozen in response to detection, but the stillness of something that does not need to move to maintain its awareness of them. He could not make out a face at that distance. What he reported, consistently without embellishment, in a statement that was reviewed and then set aside without formal challenge, was the quality of attention directed at them from that position. Focused, specific, purposeful in a way that he could not locate in any category of his prior experience. The physical description he gave, the height, the limb proportions, the shoulder width, the quality of stillness, matches the profile that has emerged from thousands of documented Bigfoot encounter reports across North America. Not in general terms, in specific, measurable terms. The height estimated at 7 to 8 feet, the arm length relative to torso suggesting a proportional structure distinct from any known primate. The capacity for sustained stillness that observers consistently describe as unlike any animal behavior they have previously witnessed. The second man raised his rifle. The surviving man told him not to shoot. He has said this decision was not reasoned. It was instinctive. Some comprehension that the situation did not permit the response that training would suggest. When I read that part of his statement, I believed it immediately, because I think that instinct was correct. What the surviving man understood in that moment, without being able to articulate it, was that he was not dealing with something that a rifle would stop. That awareness, that specific recognition, appears in documented Bigfoot encounter accounts with a consistency that is difficult to dismiss. The shape moved laterally, a single step, and was behind the trunk of a large tree, gone from sight but not from presence. Both men understood that distinction clearly. They moved away, putting distance between themselves and the bone pile. They had covered roughly 100 yards when the second man stepped on a loose rock and went down hard, twisted his ankle badly, his rifle discharged into the canopy. He could walk, but not fast. While navigating a steep ridge with the injured man, the surviving man looked down into the hollow below and saw what appeared to be the 53-year-old, his clothing, his posture, his build, standing still at the bottom, facing away from them. He called down to him. The figure did not respond. He looked more carefully. The face was wrong. The eyes placed too wide for the skull, the jaw too narrow, the skin visible from 60 yards in a way that did not look like human skin. It was wearing the missing man's clothing. It was standing in the missing man's posture. It was not the missing man. It raised one hand, the universal human gesture for approach. Come down, come closer. This element of the account, the mimicry, the deliberate imitation of a known person, is one of the most documented and most disturbing behavioral characteristics associated with Bigfoot in areas of prolonged territorial activity. It has been reported in the Ozarks, it has been reported in the Pacific Northwest, in the Appalachians, in the forests of the upper Midwest. The capacity to observe, learn, and reproduce human appearance and gesture at a distance sufficient to deceive. The use of that mimicry as a lure. What the surviving man described in his statement is not an anomaly, it is a documented pattern. The second man fired 3 times. The surviving man doesn't know if any of the shots connected. The figure moved upslope toward them at a speed he described as impossible for that terrain. Not running, moving through the underbrush as if the physical resistance of the vegetation did not apply to it. 60 yards in seconds. The second man went down. The surviving man ran. He ran down the ridge without regard to the ground, falling twice on the rocks. He described hearing something behind him that consistently maintained a fixed distance regardless of how fast he moved, not gaining, not falling back, simply present, as if the gap between them was being managed. He found a crack in a rock outcrop barely wide enough for his body and pushed himself into it. He held still. Something passed the outcrop. He felt the weight of it through the stone. He detected a smell, not animal, not chemical, not any category of odor he could place from 41 years in the outdoors. The smell lasted less than a minute. Then the vibrations stopped. The silence returned, the same silence that had been in that corridor since they arrived. He stayed in the crack until dawn. He reached the road at the end of the following day. He drove to town and walked into the county sheriff's office. His injuries included 3 parallel lacerations running from his shoulder to his hip, deep enough to require muscle reconstruction. The surgeon asked what made the marks. He said he must have fallen on something. The surgeon noted that the wounds were inconsistent with any natural surface feature he could identify. Search teams went in. They found the camp. They found the bone pile. They found the pack and rifle at the oldest member's last position. They found the rock outcrop where the surviving man had hidden. They did not find the 2 missing men. They did not find what had killed one of them and taken the other. The official determination was hunting accident, disorientation, 2 men missing and presumed dead. The section of forest was closed 3 months later under a wildlife management provision. No expiration date. It has not been reopened. I was retired when all of this happened, but I spent 22 years in that forest, and I will tell you this plainly. That closure is not a wildlife management measure. I have seen wildlife management closures. I have written them. They have expiration dates. They have monitoring provisions. They have specific documented justifications. This closure has none of those things. It is a permanent designation that references a provision it does not actually fit, and everyone in that agency who worked the southeastern sector during my tenure knew why. Not because anyone said it directly, because we had all spent enough time near that corridor to understand what the evidence pointed toward, and because the word Bigfoot, spoken in a professional context, ends careers faster than almost anything else in wildlife management. The Coldwater Ridge Corridor has been the site of 14 documented disappearances across 37 years. 9 individuals found, 7 in locations that contradict standard search probabilities. 5 never found at all. Search dogs refusing to work in specific sectors across 7 separate unrelated incidents. Track evidence from 1998 and 2003 consistent with Bigfoot physical characteristics. Vocalizations described by experienced outdoorsmen that matched the documented acoustic profile of Bigfoot reports across the region. A bone deposit in a single location representing multiple individuals accumulated over decades, and a shape seen by 2 men near that deposit, a shape that matched the physical profile reported in thousands of Bigfoot encounter accounts. that move through terrain no human being could move through at that speed. I filed reports on many of these things over 22 years. I documented what I personally observed. I recorded what was brought to me, and I was told, consistently and professionally, to log it, file it, and move on. I moved on. For a long time I moved on. I don't think that was the right decision. Across 37 years, 14 documented cases share the same specific characteristics. The corridor provides sufficient physical complexity to explain individual failures of navigation, individual accidents, individual losses of direction in difficult terrain. These explanations are real, and they apply to wilderness incidents throughout the Missouri Ozarks and beyond. They account for some of what the record shows. They do not account for the consistency of what the record shows. They do not account for recoveries in areas that had already been searched. They do not account for the persistent absence of personal equipment across multiple unrelated incidents spanning decades. They do not account for the behavioral pattern in trained search dogs documented independently across 7 separate operations. They do not account for track evidence matching the documented physical profile of Bigfoot across multiple years and multiple observers. They do not account for a bone deposit representing multiple individuals accumulated in a single location over what the evidence suggests was a period of decades. And they do not account for what 2 men saw near that deposit in November 2017. Standard explanations have limits. Terrain disorientation has limits. Known wildlife behavior has limits. When those limits are consistently reached by a specific set of documented observations in a specific geographic location, observations that align with specificity and consistency with the documented pattern of Bigfoot activity in the Ozark region, the gap between what happened and what should have happened becomes the most significant fact in the record. The Coldwater Ridge corridor remains closed. The forest around it continues to function as designed, managed, monitored, heavily used by visitors who complete their trips without incident. Rangers maintain their patrol schedules. The infrastructure operates as intended. The corridor itself operates according to different rules. I spent 22 years trying to understand that. I found tracks in 1998 that told me what I was dealing with. I spent the next 16 years of my career watching the evidence accumulate and watching the agency respond to it with the same professional silence it had always used. I retired in 2015. 2 years later, 2 men died in that corridor, and a third came out with wounds that no one in that county sheriff's office wanted to formally explain. The facts continue to accumulate. The explanations continue to fall short, and the Coldwater Ridge corridor remains closed on paper, present in the landscape, and consistent in its patterns in ways that 37 years of documented record and 22 years of professional observation have not resolved. If what I've told you here is useful to you, consider subscribing to this channel. New examinations are released regularly, each following the same measured, evidence-based approach. If you have documented cases, regional knowledge, or relevant material related to this location or to Bigfoot activity in the Ozark region, you are welcome to share it in the comments. The record is incomplete. It has always been incomplete. Careful attention is sometimes the only thing that moves it forward. The corridor remains, the pattern persists, and I am 71 years old, and I will not go back in there.